Her hands were bleeding. The ground was frozen solid, but Eliza Mae Calloway kept digging. No preacher, no neighbors, no one. Just a mother, a borrowed shovel, and a pine box she had nailed together herself at 3 in the morning. When the town of Caldwell saw her alone in that churchyard, they turned away. Every single one of them. Except one man. He rode past, stopped, turned his horse around, and without a single word, he dismounted, took the shovel from her bleeding hands, and dug. Awesome. If a story like this one moves you, if you believe that one act of human decency can change a woman's entire world, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a single story. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The winter of 1883 came to Caldwell, Wyoming like a punishment. It did not drift in slow. It did not give warning. It arrived on a Tuesday night in November with a wind that split the air like an axe through dry wood, and by Wednesday morning, the ground was iron hard, and the sky was the color of an old bruise. Eliza Mae Calloway was 24 years old, and she had already learned more about cruelty than most women twice her age. She was not what Caldwell would call beautiful, not in the way they measured beauty, which was mostly about narrowness. Narrow waist, narrow face, narrow opinions about who deserved to take up space in the world. Eliza was round and full and solid, the kind of woman whose body looked built for endurance rather than decoration. Her brown hair was thick and long and usually pinned up under a wool bonnet. Her face was soft-featured and honest high cheekbones flushed pink from cold brown eyes that saw everything and forgave too much. She had come to Caldwell 3 years ago with a husband who did not stay long enough to matter, and left behind only 2 things worth keeping: a small clapboard house on the edge of town, and a baby boy named Thomas. Thomas James Calloway. He had his mother's brown eyes and his father's stubbornness, and for 2 years and 4 months, he had been the entire architecture of Eliza's life. Every morning she woke up for him. Every loaf of bread she baked in her small kitchen. Every jar of preserves she sold to the general store. Every cold night she worked, by candlelight mending other people's clothes, all of it was for Thomas. On the night of November 14, 1883, Thomas spiked a fever so high it frightened her awake from a dead sleep. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt heat like a cast iron stove. "Hey," she whispered. "Hey, little one. I'm right here." His eyes opened halfway glassy and unfocused. "Mama," he said, and the word was so small it nearly broke her in two. She went to the neighbors first. She wrapped Thomas in every blanket she owned, pulled on her coat, and walked 3 houses down in the dark and the wind to knock on the Harmon door. Ruth Harmon was the closest thing Caldwell had to a midwife, and she answered the door in her nightgown, with a lamp held high and an expression that shifted the moment she saw who was standing on her porch. "Mrs. Calloway." Her voice cooled immediately. "Do you have any idea what time it is? My boy is sick, Ruth. He's burning up. I have my own family to attend to." Ruth's eyes moved over Eliza the way they always did, a slow sideways assessment, like she was cataloging something unpleasant. "You ought to have planned better. That child needs a doctor, not a neighbor's charity." The door closed. Eliza stood in the dark for a moment with the wind cutting through her coat. Then she walked to the doctor's house. Dr. Emmett Page was a thin, nervous man who had come to Caldwell from Philadelphia with grand ideas about frontier medicine, and had mostly settled into a comfortable routine of charging too much and working too little. He opened his door in a dressing gown and listened to Eliza with his arms crossed and his eyes already moving toward the warmth behind him. "The child is 2, he said. 2 and 4 months. Fever, and what else? He's struggling to breathe. There's a rattle in his chest when he inhales." Page's expression did not change. "It's a cold night, Mrs. Calloway. I don't make house calls in weather like this. Bring the boy to my office in the morning." "In the morning he could be—" "In the morning, Mrs. Calloway." And he closed the door, too. She ran home through the dark. She sat up all night with Thomas pressed against her chest, rocking him, talking to him, singing every song she knew twice through and then starting over. She kept the fire burning as hot as she could. She pressed cool cloths to his head. She prayed in a voice barely louder than breathing. At some point before dawn, Thomas stopped rattling when he breathed. For 1/2 second, she thought it meant he was getting better. Then she understood what silence meant. She held him for a long time after. She did not scream. She did not fall apart. She sat in the rocking chair beside the fire with her boy in her arms, and she rocked him gently the way she had every single night of his short life, and she talked to him quietly, about nothing in particular, about the birds she'd seen on the fence post last Tuesday, about the sugar cookies she'd been planning to bake him for Christmas, until the fire burned down to embers and the gray dawn light came through the window. Then she stood up. She set Thomas down carefully, gently, as if he were sleeping. She put on her coat, and she went to find a shovel. The churchyard was at the far end of Caldwell's main street, behind the white clapboard church that Reverend Hale kept meticulously clean on the outside and spiritually hollow on the inside. The ground in the churchyard was frozen solid, had been for a week, and Eliza stood before it in the gray morning light with a shovel borrowed from her own woodpile and understood that this was going to take everything she had. She started digging. The iron-hard earth gave up nothing easily. Every strike of the shovel sent a shockwave up through her arms into her shoulders. Her hands were not soft to begin with. 3 years of bread making and mending and hauling water had given her hands that could work. But the cold stole her feeling by the third strike and replaced it with a deep, bone-level aching that she chose to ignore. She dug. The town began to wake up around her. Caldwell was not a large town. Its main street held a general store, a saloon, a barber shop, a land office, and Dr. Page's practice. There was a church and a schoolhouse, and maybe 40 houses radiating out from the center, like spokes on a wheel that had never quite been built right. People here knew each other the way people know each other in small places, not deeply, but completely. They knew everything about each other and understood very little. They knew about Eliza Calloway. They knew her husband had left. They knew she ran her household alone. They knew she was, as more than one woman in town had remarked, rather large for someone who claimed to be struggling. They found her quietly ridiculous in that specific way small towns reserve for women who do not conform to the shape expected of them. So when Mabel Hutchins came out of the general store at 7:30 and saw Eliza digging in the churchyard, she stopped. She watched for a moment. She went back inside and said something to her husband. Her husband came to the door, looked, and shook his head. He went back to work. When old Pete Driscoll walked his horse past the churchyard on the way to the livery, he slowed down. He watched Eliza's arms rising and falling with the shovel. He watched the small pine box she had set in the snow beside her. He watched her face, the way her jaw was set, the way her eyes were fixed on the ground, the way she was crying without making a single sound. He kept walking. When Reverend Hale himself came out of the church to ring the morning bell, he saw Eliza in his churchyard and walked toward her, and for one moment Eliza thought she actually thought that he was coming to help. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Is that your child?" "Yes, Reverend." "I'm very sorry for your loss." He paused. "However, I should mention that this section of the yard is reserved for families with church membership. Your account with the church has not been current since—" Eliza stopped digging. She looked at him with brown eyes that had been awake all night and had not cried until an hour ago, and had stopped crying only because she could not afford to lose the feeling in her face to anything other than cold. "My son," she said very quietly, "is 2 years old." The Reverend cleared his throat. "There is a public section of the yard around the east side if you—" "Get away from me," Eliza said. Her voice did not shake. It was very steady and very soft, and it apparently contained something the Reverend recognized because he took a step back and then turned and walked to the church without another word. Eliza moved her box to the east side of the churchyard. She kept digging. She had been digging for nearly 2 hours when she heard the horse. She did not look up. Horses passed the churchyard all morning. None of them had stopped, but this one did. She heard it come to a halt outside the low fence. She heard leather creak as someone dismounted. She heard boots in the snow. And then the gate opened. It gave a small iron cry that she'd heard 100 times walking past this yard on Sunday mornings, and footsteps came toward her. She kept her eyes on the ground. She raised the shovel, brought it down. "Ma'am?" The voice was low, not loud, not performative, just a word dropped into the cold air between them like something solid. She did not answer. "Ma'am, I'd like to help you if that's all right." She stopped. She looked up for the first time. The man standing before her was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that you noticed not because it was unusual, but because the way he carried it made you feel it. He had dark hair beneath a weathered brown hat, a jaw that looked like it had been decided on firmly and never reconsidered, and eyes the color of creek water in October, somewhere between gray and green, and impossible to name exactly. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat over a dark vest with a gun belt that sat on his hips, the way gun belts sat on men who did not need to prove anything with them. His boots were good quality and trail-worn. His gloves were already in his hand. He was in the detached way that her mind catalogued things even now, one of the best-looking men she had ever seen in her life. And he was looking at her not with pity, and not with the particular brand of assessment that men in Caldwell usually aimed at her, but with something straightforward and serious that she did not have a word for immediately. "Who are you?" she said. "Name's Colt Bridger." He held out his hand. "I ride for the Whitmore spread east of town. I was passing through on an errand, and I saw you out here." A pause. "I saw you when you started this morning." Something moved across her face that she could not control. "Then you watched for 2 hours." "I stopped when I first saw you," he said, and his voice did not flinch. "You looked like you didn't want company. I stayed by the road until I was sure." "Sure of what?" "Sure you needed the help whether you wanted the company or not." She stared at him. He held her gaze without any particular difficulty. "That's your boy," he said. It was not a question. "Thomas," she said. "He was 2. Colt Bridger looked at the small pine box in the snow. Something moved across his face that he did not bother to hide. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. Not a speech. Not a set of words arranged to be adequate. Just 2 words that sounded like he meant them. "I don't need your pity," Eliza said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. "No, ma'am," he said. "You need someone to dig. There's a difference." He held out his hand for the shovel. She did not give it to him. "I can manage," she said. "I know you can." He did not lower his hand. "Let me help anyway." For a long moment she held the shovel and looked at this stranger and catalogued every reason not to trust him. There were many. She had assembled a thorough collection of reasons not to trust men who offered things, and they had all been earned honestly. But her hands were bleeding. She had not noticed until now the cold had kept the pain away, but the skin on her palms had split in 2 places and left rust-colored smears on the shovel handle. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. She held out the shovel. He took it. He stepped into the hole she had made already more than a foot deep, though the ground fought her every inch, and he started digging with a rhythm that was efficient and unhurried, and made the earth come up in a way it had not come up for her, because he was simply stronger than she was, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She stood at the edge of the hole and watched. After a moment, she picked up the broken-handled smaller spade she had brought as a backup and started working alongside him from the other end. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know. People will talk." "People talk regardless," he said without looking up. "I've found it's rarely worth adjusting your behavior on their account." She dug in silence for a moment. "You're not from Caldwell." "No, ma'am. Missouri originally. Been in Wyoming territory 6 years. The Whitmore spread," she said. "That's the big ranch east of the ridge." "Yes, ma'am." "You're the foreman," she said, because she had heard the name Bridger once or twice in connection with that operation, mentioned in the way that men mentioned competent men briefly, and with the specific kind of respect they reserve for people who do not require their admiration to function. He glanced up at her with a brief expression she could not entirely read. "Yes, ma'am." "You don't have to call me ma'am," she said. "My name is Eliza Calloway." "Eliza," he said, and went back to digging. It should not have meant anything, just her own name said by a stranger in a churchyard on the worst morning of her life. It meant something. They had been digging together for 20 minutes when Franklin Mears walked by. Franklin Mears was the kind of man who was not particularly successful, or particularly intelligent, or particularly anything, but who had discovered early in life that a loud voice and a crowd's willingness to follow it were sufficient substitutes for character. He owned a small dry goods operation near the saloon and had opinions about everything that he did not keep to himself. He stopped at the churchyard fence. "Well, I'll be," he said. He was talking to another man walking beside him. Eliza did not know his name, and he said it at full volume the way people say things when they intend to be overheard. "Widow Calloway's got herself some help, looks like. Bridger, that you?" Colt did not look up. "Must be real grateful to get a hand," Mears said, and the other man laughed at something in the way he said it. Eliza felt the familiar heat move up from her chest to her face. Not shame, she had long ago done her best to convert shame into something more useful, but anger, which was harder to manage and required more careful storage. She kept digging. "Hey, Bridger," Mears called again louder. "Thought you had more sense than to get mixed up with—" Colt stopped digging. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn fully toward Mears. He simply stopped digging, stood up straight to his full height, and looked at Franklin Mears across the churchyard with an expression that Eliza could not see from her angle, but that she could measure by its effect, which was that Mears stopped talking immediately and looked suddenly occupied by something in the middle distance. Colt went back to digging. Mears and his companion walked on quickly without further commentary. Eliza watched the place where they had stood for a moment. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "That they'll talk about this?" "No." He turned up another shovelful of earth. "Does it bother you?" "I've been talked about in this town for 3 years," she said. "I've learned to carry it." He glanced at her briefly. "You shouldn't have to." "A lot of things shouldn't be true that are true anyway," she said. He considered that for a moment. Then he nodded once like someone acknowledging a point they cannot argue. When the grave was deep enough and Colt dug it deep enough deeper than it needed to be by any practical measure, and she understood that this was a form of respect, they stopped. Eliza went to the pine box. It was not large. She had built it herself in the dark hours of early morning with the small box of carpentry tools her husband had left behind working by lantern light, with hands she had to blow on every few minutes to keep them useful. It was not beautiful, but the corners were tight and the lid was nailed straight, and she had lined the inside with the softest blanket she owned, a faded blue wool one she had bought the week after Thomas was born. She knelt in the snow beside it. She pressed her hand to the lid for a long moment, and her lips moved, but whatever she was saying, she said it privately in a voice too low to carry. Then she stood up. She did not ask Colt for help with this part. She lifted the box herself. He understood immediately and did not reach for it, but he walked beside her to the graveside. And when she knelt to set the box down, and her hands shook just slightly, for just a moment, he was close enough that she could feel the solid presence of him without it being intrusive, just there, like a windbreak, like something that knew when to be useful without being asked. She set Thomas down. She stood. She bowed her head and said a prayer that she had composed herself because she had decided at some point in the last 12 hours that she would not say Reverend Hale's words over her boy's grave and would instead use her own. It was short and plain and said only the important things: that Thomas James Calloway had been loved with everything she had, that he had been kind, even as a baby, in the way some children are simply born kind, that the world was smaller and colder for his absence, and that she intended to live in a way that would have made him proud, however long that took and however hard it turned out to be. When she finished, she picked up the shovel. "Eliza," Colt said. She looked at him. "Let me." She handed him the shovel without argument this time. He filled the grave with the same unhurried rhythm as before, and she stood beside him in the gray winter light with her bleeding hands clasped in front of her, and watched, and if she cried again, she cried quietly. And that was all right, because there was no one here to judge her for it. And the one person present had already demonstrated that he was not in the business of judging. When it was done, Colt removed his hat. He held it at his side and stood for a moment with his head bowed, and the wind moved across the churchyard, and the snow shifted, and nothing in Caldwell acknowledged the small grave at the east end of the churchyard except the man standing beside it. Then he put his hat back on. He turned to Eliza. "Is there someone who can take you home?" he asked. "I'll walk," she said. "It's a fair distance in this cold." "I walked here," she said. "I can walk back." He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and whatever he was thinking, he kept to himself. "I'll walk with you," he said, "if you'll allow it." She almost said no. The word formed itself automatically, built from years of practice at not needing anyone, at being the kind of woman who managed alone, because alone was safer than dependence, and dependence was where hope went to die. But she was so tired. She had not slept in more than 30 hours. Her hands were bleeding, and her arms ached to the shoulder, and her whole chest felt like something had been removed from it with insufficient anesthetic. "All right," she said. They walked together along Caldwell's main street, and people saw them, and people talked, and Eliza held her head up, and Colt Bridger walked beside her with his hat on, and his stride steady, and neither of them said anything about the people watching, because some things are beneath the dignity of comment. When they reached her house, she stopped at the gate. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it needed more than that, she said, I'm not sure I would have." She stopped. "Thank you." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Eliza," she corrected automatically. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, something quieter. "Eliza," he said. She turned toward the house. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice stopped her. She turned. He was turning his hat in his hands, and the gesture was at odds with his general stillness, like something that had found its way around his careful composure. "I'll be passing through Caldwell again, in a week or so, on business." A pause. "I'd like to know you're all right." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You did a kind thing this morning. You don't owe me anything beyond it." "No, ma'am," he agreed. "I don't." He met her eyes. "I'd like to know anyway." She stood there in the cold at her own gate, with the wind coming down the street and the gray sky pressing down on everything, and a man she had met 3 hours ago looking at her like she was someone worth looking at. "I'll be here," she said finally. She went inside. She sat down in the rocking chair beside the cold fireplace, and she put her face in her bleeding hands, and she let herself come apart for exactly as long as it took. And then she put herself back together and rebuilt the fire, and boiled water for the hands, and made tea, because there was no one else to make it. But through the small front window she could see the churchyard road, and she could see just barely at the edge of her sight a man on horseback sitting still for a moment at the top of the road before he turned his horse and rode east. Like someone who had wanted to be sure. Like someone who had stayed until he knew she'd made it inside. Eliza wrapped both hands around her tea and watched until he was out of sight, and for the first time in 3 years, in the cold and the quiet of the worst morning of her life, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. Not safe, not rescued, seen. He came back in 7 days, not 8, not 10. 7. Eliza counted them, not because she was waiting, she told herself, but because counting gave the days a shape they would not otherwise have had. The first day after Thomas was formless and terrible. The second day, she got out of bed because the alternative was unthinkable, and she had never been the kind of woman who chose the unthinkable. The third day she baked bread, not to sell, just to have something to do with her hands that was not grieving. By the 7th day she had established a routine that resembled living closely enough to pass from the outside as the real thing. She was measuring flour when she heard the horse. She did not go to the window. She finished measuring. She set the cup down. And then, because she was human and not a saint, she went to the window. Colt Bridger was dismounting at her front gate. He was wearing the same heavy canvas coat, a different hat, darker, with a wider brim, and he was carrying something across his saddle that she could not immediately identify. He tied his horse at the post, took the something down from the saddle, and came to the door. She was already there when he knocked. "Eliza?" he said. "Mr. Bridger." "Colt," he said immediately. "I told you 7 days. You said a week or so. 7 days is a week. 7 days is less than a week, and so is technically covered under or so." She stopped herself. The sentence had come out of nowhere, a reflex from some previous version of herself who had sparred with words before she learned that sparring was not worth the energy. She saw something shift in his expression, something that moved quickly across his face and then was gone. "Fair point," he said. He held out what he was carrying. It was a tin sealed at the top. "From Mrs. Whitmore. She heard—" He stopped. "She wanted to send something." Eliza looked at the tin. "You told Mrs. Whitmore about me." "I told her what happened," he said. "She's a decent woman. She wanted to help and didn't know how." This was what she came up with. Eliza took the tin. It was heavier than it looked. "What's in it?" "Honey cake. She makes it when people are low." Something moved in Eliza's chest that she was not prepared for. Honey cake. She had not expected honey cake from a stranger to undo something in her, but apparently the specific combination of a near stranger's ordinary kindness and a tin that was heavy with someone's effort was sufficient. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Here, he sat at her kitchen table like someone who had learned long ago how to take up exactly the right amount of space, not too much, not too little. He set his hat on his knee. He looked around her kitchen the way people look at rooms they are trying to understand a person through, and what her kitchen said about her was that she was practical and capable, and that she had very good instincts about bread. "You bake," he said. "It keeps me occupied." She filled the kettle. "And it pays. I sell to the general store. Miners buy from me direct sometimes on their way through." She paused. "It's enough. How long have you been in Caldwell?" 3 years. She set the kettle on the stove. "I came from Kansas originally. My husband brought us out here." A pause. "He stayed 14 months. Colt was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He was not a man who deserved a great deal of grief." She said it plainly without bitterness, which was the only way she had learned to say true things about James Calloway without it costing her something. "He left. Thomas and I managed without him." The name landed in the air between them, and she felt the familiar drop in her chest, the way Thomas's name had started to feel since last week, like a step on a staircase that wasn't there anymore. Colt did not look away or redirect the conversation, both of which she appreciated. "Tell me about him," he said. She turned from the stove. "Beg your pardon, Thomas." He met her eyes. "Tell me about him. What he was like." Nobody had asked her that. In 7 days, not one person in Caldwell had asked her to describe her son. They had offered condolences and pitying looks and turned away, and she had been left alone with the fullness of who Thomas was and no one to tell it to. She turned back to the kettle. She needed a moment. "He was stubborn," she said. "From the beginning, just completely stubborn. I think he came out of the womb already decided about things." She heard the sound in her voice that she couldn't quite control. Half laughter, half something that would become crying if she wasn't careful. "He loved dogs. He'd never met one we didn't have one, but he knew what they were from a picture book I had, and he talked about getting one with the confidence of a man who had already made arrangements. He was planning to name it General." Colt made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and genuine. "He liked to be sung to," she continued, her voice steadier now that she was going. "Didn't matter what song. I used to sing him old hymns, and he'd correct me when I changed the words. 2 years old, and he would look at me very seriously and say, "That ain't how it goes, Mama." She stopped. I have no idea where he got the ear for it. "He sounds remarkable," Colt said. And he said it the way people say things they actually mean, which was different from the way people said it to be kind. She poured the tea. She carried the cups to the table and sat across from him, and they drank tea in her kitchen, and she told him more about Thomas, and he listened the whole time in a way that was very complete and very still, and it was the first time in 7 days that she had felt the weight of Thomas's absence become just slightly more bearable. That was the first visit. So, he came back 3 days later. This time he brought nothing from the Whitmore ranch. He brought himself and said he had business in Caldwell and thought he'd stop. She did not question the business because it was none of hers, and she made coffee instead of tea because she had run out of the good tea and only had the bitter kind that she herself disliked. He drank the coffee without complaint. They talked about the territory, the winter, the state of the roads, whether the spring flooding was going to be as bad as the year before, and it was the kind of conversation that was about something and also about nothing. The kind that builds something between people before either of them has agreed to build anything. When he left, she noticed she had been talking for 40 minutes and had not once calculated how she was being perceived. She stood at the door after he rode away and thought about that for a while. The third visit was 12 days after Thomas's funeral, and it did not go smoothly. Eliza had had a bad morning. Not bad in the dramatic way nothing had happened. It was just a Tuesday that had decided to be relentless. She had burned her bread first time in years, and the smoke had filled the kitchen, and she'd had to open the door in the cold and stand there in the rush of freezing air. And that was when she had spotted across the street Mabel Hutchins watching her from the dry goods porch with an expression that Eliza had cataloged 100 times and could translate without effort. "There she is, look at that, must be hard to manage when you're that size." She was in no mood for company when Colt arrived that afternoon. He knocked. She answered. She could feel from the way her face was arranged that she was not presenting her best version. "Bad day," he said. It was not a question. "I burned my bread," she said. "That's recoverable." The second batch took. The morning was still a waste. She stepped back to let him in. "I have nothing to offer you. I'm out of tea and the coffee is worse than last time, and I burned the bread." He came in. He looked at the blackened loaf sitting on the counter. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She blinked. "Beg your pardon?" "Sit down," he repeated. "I'll make the coffee." "You don't know where anything—" "I'll find it." He was already moving past her toward the stove, with the unceremonious comfort of a person who learned kitchens fast and did not require a tour. She sat down at the kitchen table. She sat down because she was tired, and because something about being told to sit down in her own kitchen, not unkindly, not presumptuously, just with the quiet confidence of someone who had correctly assessed the situation, was so unexpected that she complied before she'd thought about whether to comply. She watched him find the coffee, find the grinder, locate the cups by opening exactly the right cabinet on the first try. "You're efficient," she said. "I run a ranch," he said over the sound of grinding. "Efficiency is a survival skill." "Do you do this for all the ranch hands? Make them sit down when they've had bad days?" He glanced at her briefly. "No." She looked at the table. "Then why?" "Because you've been taking care of everything yourself for 3 years," he said in a tone that was not gentle exactly, but was something adjacent to it, something more serious than gentle. "And you're allowed to sit down when you've burned your bread, Eliza. You don't have to manage everything in front of me." She was quiet. The sound of the coffee was loud in the small kitchen. "The Hutchins woman was looking at me again today," she said finally. Not because she had planned to say it, but because the words were there and there was suddenly somewhere to put them. From across the street. "She's been doing it for 3 years. That particular look that says everything she thinks about me without requiring her to actually say it to my face." He poured the water. He did not interject. "And I know it shouldn't still—" She stopped. "I know I should be past letting it land. I've had 3 years of practice, not letting it land. But today it landed. She put her hands flat on the table. I'm so tired of being looked at like I'm some kind of cautionary tale. He set the cup in front of her. He sat across from her with his own cup. What does that look say? He asked. She glanced at him. You know what it says. Tell me anyway. She looked at him steadily. It says look at her trying to live as if she has the right to take up that much space. It says no wonder her husband left. It says there's what happens when a woman doesn't bother to be what she should be. Colt was quiet for a moment. That says a great deal more about Mabel Hutchins than it says about you, he said. I know that. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Knowing it and being immune to it are two different things. Yes, he said. They are. Something about the way he agreed with her simply and without trying to fix it loosened something in her chest. Why do you keep coming back here? She asked. The question came out more direct than she intended, but she was too tired today for indirection. He looked at her across the table. Why do you think? I genuinely don't know, she said. That's why I asked. You're the foreman of the largest ranch in the county. You could spend your time in the saloon or visiting any number of women who are... She stopped. I don't know why you keep coming here. I keep coming here, he said carefully, because I find myself thinking about this house when I'm not in it. He paused. And about the woman in it. The kitchen was very quiet. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Say something like that as if it's uncomplicated. She set the cup down. It's not uncomplicated, Colt. You know what this town thinks. You know what they'll say if you... I know exactly what they'll say, he said. I told you before, I don't adjust my behavior for what people choose to say. It's easy to say that until they're saying it about someone you're connected to. Her voice was steady, but something beneath it was not. I've lived with what they say about me for 3 years. I can carry it. But I won't be the reason someone else has to carry it. He looked at her for a long moment. Let me ask you something, he said. Is that actually your concern? Or is it easier to say it's your concern so you don't have to say the real thing? She stared at him. The real thing. He continued, his voice even. Being that you've been let down before and you're not sure it's worth the risk of hoping again. The silence stretched between them. Eliza picked up her cup. She drank her coffee. She looked at the wall. That's very presumptuous, she said. Yes, ma'am, he agreed. You don't know me well enough to say something like that. No, ma'am, he agreed again. Another pause. You're not wrong, she said so quietly that it barely made it across the table. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The town noticed, of course. Caldwell was small enough that a man's horse tied outside a particular house 3 times in 2 weeks was a social event, sufficient to generate commentary for a month. Eliza was aware of the commentary the way you are aware of weather constantly, unavoidably, with a resignation that is not quite acceptance. She heard it from the girl who came to buy bread on Saturday mornings. Not said to her directly, but said in the vicinity, which was a peculiar specialty of Caldwell's female population. I don't know what he sees in her, honestly, said the voice of Dorothy Mears Franklin's wife, from approximately 2 feet away in the general store, while Eliza was purchasing sugar. A man like that, it doesn't make sense. Maybe he feels sorry for her, said the second voice, younger, unidentified. On account of the baby. I heard she's been feeding him, Dorothy said, having him over to her house, which is well. Whatever keeps him out of decent women's hair, I suppose. Eliza counted the money for her sugar with complete precision and said nothing. But walking home, she stopped in the middle of the street. She stood there in the cold with her sugar and thought about what she had just heard, and thought about what Colt had said in her kitchen, and thought about Thomas, who had looked at the world with brown eyes and complete confidence that the world was worth looking at. She thought, I am 24 years old, and I have buried my son and outlasted a husband who did not deserve the name, and I am still standing in the middle of Caldwell's main street with sugar I paid for with money I earned, and if Dorothy Mears has something to say about it, she can say it to my face." She walked home. She baked the best bread she had made in weeks. It was the fourth visit that changed things. Colt arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and he was not alone. Standing beside him at her gate was a woman Eliza did not recognize. Tall, well-dressed with silver hair and an expression of composed authority that suggested she was accustomed to being the most competent person in any given room. She was perhaps 60, with good hands and sharp eyes and a straight back. "Eliza," Colt said, "this is Margaret Whitmore, the ranch." Mrs. Whitmore extended her hand before Eliza could arrange her face into whatever expression was appropriate. "I've been wanting to meet you," she said. The honey cake felt insufficient. Eliza shook her hand. "It was very kind, Mrs. Whitmore." "Margaret." She looked at Eliza with those sharp eyes in a way that was not unkind, but was very thorough. "Colt tells me you bake." "I do. He says your bread is the best in the county." She glanced at Colt with an expression that contained something Eliza could not immediately read. He said that on approximately 3 separate occasions, unprompted. Colt looked at the fence post. "Come inside," Eliza said because she did not know what else to do. They sat in her kitchen, all 3 of them, and Margaret Whitmore drank tea and ate half a loaf of the bread Eliza had made that morning, and had a very direct conversation that Eliza had not anticipated. "I want to propose something to you," Margaret said. "I have 23 men on the Whitmore spread, and I have a cook who is leaving in the spring. The position is salaried. You'd have your own quarters. Your bakery work can continue alongside it if that matters to you, and I suspect it does." She set her teacup down. "You would not need to sell to the general store to cover your expenses. You would have a fixed income, a place to live that is not in the middle of a town that has not treated you well, and you would be among people who do not know your history, and therefore have no opinions about it." Eliza sat very still. She did not look at Colt. She could feel him looking at her. "This is very generous," she said carefully. "It's practical," Margaret said. "I need a cook. You need a change." She paused. "It is also, I admit, somewhat generated by the fact that my foreman has been distracted for the past 2 weeks in a way that is unusual for him and that I have traced to the source." She glanced at Colt again. "I have no objection to the source." "Margaret," Colt said. "I'm being efficient," she said without looking at him. "You were taking too long." She looked back at Eliza. "You don't have to decide now. Think about it." After Margaret left, she rode back to the ranch alone, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had delivered her message and saw no reason to linger. Eliza and Colt stood at her gate in the cold. "Did you know she was going to say that?" Eliza asked. "The general idea," he said. "Not the exact she improvises. Did you ask her to offer me the position?" He considered his words. "I mentioned that the cook situation needed to be resolved before spring. I may have mentioned it in the context of a broader conversation." "About me?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He held her gaze. "Because I meant what I said in your kitchen. I think about this house when I'm not in it." He paused. "And I'd rather think about you less than 2 hours ride away." The wind moved down the street. Somewhere a door closed. "You are the most straightforward person I have ever met," she said. "I have found that indirection wastes time. It also protects people." "From what?" She looked at him. "From saying yes when they're not sure they should." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you saying yes?" She looked at her house. At the front door she had walked through 10,000 times alone mostly. At the window where she had watched him ride away 7 days ago and felt for the first time in years like someone had looked at her and seen something worth looking for. "I need more time," she said. "You have it," he said immediately. "No pressure, no performance of patience, just the fact of it." She nodded. He put his hat on. "Colt." She stopped him. He turned. "Why me?" She asked it plainly, the way you ask a question you have been carrying for 2 weeks and have finally decided to put down. Out of every woman in the county, out of every woman who is... She stopped. Why me? He looked at her for a long time. Because you built your son's coffin yourself, he said. At 3 a.m, alone, in the dark. And then you got up and dug his grave in frozen ground, and you held your head up walking back through this town when every one of them was watching, and you went inside and you kept going. He held her gaze. That is not a woman I would choose to be anywhere other than where she is. She stood at her gate in the cold and said nothing. After a moment, he touched the brim of his hat the smallest gesture and turned back to his horse. She watched him ride away. She turned and went inside. She sat at the kitchen table where they had drunk coffee, and he had told her to sit down on a bad day, and she thought about what he had just said. She thought about it for a long time. She was not sure she believed it entirely. She was not sure she should believe it. But for the first time in 3 years, she was considering the possibility that someone's opinion of her might be worth the risk of caring about. That was new. That was the most frightening thing she had felt in years. And she sat with it in the quiet kitchen with her hands flat on the table and let it be frightening because Thomas had taught her that the things worth having were the things that frightened you first, and she was still learning to take his lessons seriously. 3 days after Margaret Whitmore's visit, Franklin Mears found Colt at the saloon. Eliza heard about it secondhand, the way she heard about most things in Caldwell, not from the people involved, but from the commentary those people generated in their wake. It was the bread girl who told her 17-year-old Nora Jenks, who delivered to 2 houses on the West End, and had very good ears and almost no filter between what she heard and what she repeated. Mr. Mears said something to Mr. Bridger at the saloon Tuesday. Nora said, handing over the coins for her bread, with the air of someone getting to the important part of a longer story. Something about you, Mrs. Calloway. About why a man like Mr. Bridger would be spending time with... She stopped, apparently remembering who she was talking to. With you. What did Mr. Bridger say? Eliza asked. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Mr. Mears for about 30 seconds. Nora demonstrated the look which even her 17-year-old imitation rendered fairly uncomfortable. And then he said, Mears, I'd think carefully about finishing that sentence. And Mr. Mears said, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. And Mr. Bridger said, Nora paused for effect. Nora. He said, then everyone should think better. And then he picked up his drink and walked out. Eliza stood with her bread and said nothing for a moment. Did he now? She said. Yes, ma'am. Nora's eyes were very bright. The whole saloon heard it. Eliza sent her on her way and went back inside and stood in the middle of her kitchen. Then everyone should think better. 7 words. Simple. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, no performance. She sat down at her kitchen table for the second time in 2 weeks, at someone else's suggestion this time, without anyone present to give the suggestion, and she pressed both hands to her face and breathed slowly. She was not safe from this. She had genuinely convinced herself through 3 careful years that she had arrived at a place past needing, past the specific vulnerability of wanting to be chosen by someone who was worth being chosen by. She had built a self-sufficient life in Caldwell, with her bread and her mending and her one good coat, and she had been adequate. Adequate was not, she realized, sitting in her kitchen with her hands on her face, the same as enough. She had not let herself know that until now. She had not let herself know it because knowing it required also knowing that she was not actually past needing, that she was 24 years old, and she had been let down and left behind and laughed at, and that she wanted, still wanted, underneath all the careful layers of self-sufficiency, to be loved by someone who saw her fully and stayed. She pressed her hands harder against her face. Thomas's voice came back to her unprompted and clear. That ain't how it goes, Mama. She laughed. It came out half broken, but it was real, and it moved through her chest like something being cleared. and she lowered her hands and looked at her kitchen, at the good stove and the bread that hadn't burned today, and the cups still on the table from this morning, and she thought, all right. She was going to be frightened, and she was going to do it anyway. Chand. She sent him a note. It was short because she had never been comfortable with verbal excess, and because the thing she had to say was not complicated. She sent it via Nora Jenks, who was delighted to be used as a courier, and asked no questions, which was a remarkable act of restraint that Eliza mentally credited to her. The note said, I've thought about it. Tell Mrs. Whitmore I accept the position, and tell her I'd like to speak with you before I come. There are things I need to say to you directly. E.C. She sealed it and sent it, and spent the rest of the afternoon making bread, and not thinking about it, which was not entirely successful, but was adequate. He arrived the following morning. She opened the door before he knocked. She had been watching. She was not going to pretend otherwise, and he stood on her porch with his hat in his hand and his gray-green eyes taking in whatever her face was currently communicating, which was probably a great deal. You came fast, she said. Your note was not an ambiguous document, he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. They stood in her front room, and she did not go to the kitchen, and she did not offer tea, and she did not build any preamble because preamble was cowardice dressed up as courtesy. I need you to understand something, she said. Before this goes any further, before I come to the ranch or accept anything from you or Margaret or anyone else. All right. I am not a project, she said. I am not a woman you've decided to rescue because you found me in a churchyard and felt something about it. I have been looked at like a charity case by this entire town for 3 years, and I will not replace that with a different version of the same thing, even a kindly meant one. She held his gaze. If what you feel for me is pity with a better face on it, tell me now. I can handle it. I cannot handle finding that out later. He was quiet for a moment. Is that what you think it is? He said. I think it might be, she said honestly. I think you're a good man who found a woman in a very low moment, and that your instinct is to help and protect. And I think it is entirely possible that what you're calling something else is actually that. And I need to know if you've considered that. I've considered it, he said, and I spent 14 days going out of my way to find reasons to be in Caldwell, which is not on my way to anything when I have a ranch to run and could have found other places to be. He looked at her. I don't do things that aren't worth doing, Eliza. I'm not built that way. I'm here because I want to be here, because you are. He stopped. The pause was not uncertainty. It was the pause of a man choosing words with care. Because you are unlike anyone I have met in this territory, or before it. And that is not pity. That is the most uncomplicated thing I have felt about another person in a very long time. She stood there. She had prepared herself for several responses. She had not prepared herself for uncomplicated. She had not had uncomplicated in a very long time either. I'm coming to the ranch, she said. I'm accepting the position. She took a breath. And I'm telling you clearly, I need it to be slow. Whatever this is, whatever it might become, I need it to be slow. I need to trust what I see before I trust what I feel. That's reasonable, he said. It might take time. I have time. She looked at him. Colt, I'm serious. I may take a great deal of time. The corner of his mouth moved. Eliza, I just rode 4 hours round trip on account of a 6-line note. I think my position on time is clear. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the morning in the churchyard, for the first time in more days than she cared to count, Eliza Mae Calloway almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was the beginning of one. The architecture of something that had not been possible before and was only barely possible now. But it was real. And in the window behind her, the winter light was shifting just slightly, just barely toward something that was not yet spring, but was no longer entirely winter. Something was changing. She was not sure she could stop it now, even if she wanted to. She was not entirely sure she wanted to. She moved to the Whitmore Ranch on a Tuesday in early December, 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, with everything she owned fitting into 2 trunks and a flour sack. Caldwell did not say goodbye. That was not accurate, a few people did. Nora Jenks cried openly at the gate and pressed a handkerchief into Eliza's hand that had clearly been embroidered specifically for the occasion, which meant Nora had known before Eliza told her, which meant Nora's ears were even better than Eliza had estimated. Old Pete Driscoll tipped his hat from across the street, the same man who had ridden past her in the churchyard without stopping, and Eliza accepted the gesture for what it was, belated, insufficient, and honest, and tipped her head in return. The rest of Caldwell watched from windows and doorways with the concentrated interest of people who have found a new story to replace the old one. Colt loaded the trunks onto the wagon himself. He did not make ceremony of it. He did not offer commentary on what she was leaving behind or what she was moving toward. He simply put her things on the wagon, checked the tie-downs, and held out his hand to help her up. She took it. His hand was warm, even through both their gloves, and she let go of it immediately once she was seated, because she had promised herself slow, and she intended to keep that promise, even when keeping it was inconvenient. He drove. She sat beside him and watched Caldwell fall away behind the wagon, and she did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was relief. She felt instead something more complicated, the particular grief of leaving a place that had treated you badly, which is not about loving the place, but about the years you put into it that do not come back when you go. "You all right?" Colt said, not looking at her. "I'll let you know when I've determined the answer," she said. He nodded, drove. The ranch emerged from the winter landscape 2 hours later, and it was larger than she had imagined. Not ostentatious, there was nothing decorative about the Whitmore operation, but solid and extensive, the kind of property that had been built by people who intended to stay. The main house was timber and stone. The bunkhouse sat east of it. 3 barns, a smokehouse, a well corrals with horses moving inside them. 23 men who would need to be fed 3 times a day. She straightened her back and cataloged the kitchen through the window before she even climbed down from the wagon. "It's a good kitchen," Colt said, reading her look. "I can see that. Better than what you had in town." She glanced at him. "Don't push your luck." He almost smiled. Margaret Whitmore met her at the door, with the brisk warmth of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in revisiting the decision. She showed Eliza the kitchen, the larder, the small room off the back of the main house that would be hers, the schedule, the preferences of 23 men regarding what they would and would not eat, and the location of everything Eliza would need, all in approximately 40 minutes, with no unnecessary language. "The previous cook," Margaret said at the end of the tour, "was adequate. You are not going to be adequate. That is why you're here." "You haven't tasted my cooking yet," Eliza said. "I tasted your bread," Margaret said. "That was sufficient." She paused. "The men will test you. They test everyone new. They will be rude about the food and make requests that are unreasonable and act as though they have preferences they do not actually have. I recommend ignoring approximately 80% of what they say for the first 2 weeks. What about the other 20%? Use your judgment." Margaret's sharp eyes held something that was almost amusement. "I suspect your judgment is sound." The men did test her. Margaret had been accurate about that. The first morning she cooked breakfast for 23 ranch hands and Colt Bridger and Margaret Whitmore, and she had been awake since 4:30. Because the scale of the operation required an hour of preparation, she could not compress. By the time the men filed in at 6, she had biscuits, eggs, salt pork, and gravy on the table, with 4 minutes to spare, and she stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded and watched them eat. A man near the far end, big, red-haired, with the particular confidence of someone who has established a social position he is not willing to risk, looked up from his plate and said loudly enough to carry, "Biscuits are heavy." The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when someone has thrown something. Eliza looked at the red-haired man. "They're trail biscuits," she said. "They're meant to be heavy. A light biscuit doesn't carry a man through until noon. If you'd prefer something more delicate, I'm sure Mrs. Whitmore can direct you to an establishment that serves that style." A beat of silence. Then the man 2 seats down from the red-haired one laughed short genuine and went back to eating. A third man reached for a second biscuit. The red-haired man, whose name she would learn was Hatch, ate 3 biscuits and said nothing further. Colt caught her eye from the end of the table, said nothing. But something in the set of his face told her she had passed something. The first week established its rhythm, and the rhythm was hard work, which suited Eliza down to the bone. Hard work had been her primary coping mechanism for 3 years, and she was good at it. She cooked. She organized. She learned the preferences and the complaints and the genuine requests, learning which 20% was worth attending to, and by Friday the kitchen was operating at a level that Margaret called in her particular idiom, satisfactory, which Eliza understood meant something considerably stronger. What she had not anticipated was the evenings. After supper was cleared, the kitchen was hers alone. The men went to the bunkhouse. Margaret retired early, and Colt had his own small house at the northeast corner of the property, separate from both the main house and the bunkhouse appropriate to his position, and he was in it. Except that on Wednesday evening, he appeared at the kitchen door at 7:30. "I thought you might want company," he said. "I thought we agreed on slow," she said. "This is slow," he said. "This is the slowest I've moved toward anything in my adult life." She gave him a look that she was aware was not entirely successful at hiding the thing it was meant to hide. "Sit down," she said. "I'm making tomorrow's bread." He sat at the kitchen table and watched her work, and they talked the way they had talked in her kitchen in Caldwell about nothing important and everything real. And it was the best hour of her day, which she noted with some concern and did not comment on. This became the pattern. Wednesday and Saturday evenings, 7:30 kitchen door. Slow. What she had also not anticipated was how much the ranch hands would talk. Not cruelly, nothing like Caldwell. But ranch hands are observers by nature, and 23 of them in close quarters with a new cook and their foreman constituting a visible and unsubtle change in behavior, generated a great deal of commentary that Eliza overheard through the walls under the door and on one occasion directly through an open window. "Bridger's spending a lot of time at the main house," said one voice young, probably the one they called Davy. "He's always spent time at the main house," said a second. "Not Wednesday and Saturday time." A pause. "She's a good cook." "She's more than a good cook is what she is," said Davy, and his tone was not unkind, just factual in the way young men are factual about things they are observing for the first time. "Leave it alone," said a third voice older, which Eliza identified as Hatch. She set down her spoon and stood very still. "I'm just saying," Davy started. "I know what you're saying," Hatch said. "I said leave it alone." A silence. "She makes good biscuits," Hatch added, apparently for the sake of conclusion. Eliza picked her spoon back up and went back to the bread. She thought about Hatch for the rest of that evening, with something that was not yet fondness, but was in the same neighborhood. It was 2 weeks into December, when the first twist came, and it came from a direction Eliza had not thought to watch. A woman arrived at the Whitmore Ranch on a Thursday afternoon. Eliza was in the kitchen when she heard the carriage. She did not think much of it. Margaret had visitors, occasionally business partners and suppliers, and 2 members of the county land board who came by monthly to discuss something that was always described as territory matters, and that Eliza had learned not to ask about. But when she brought out the coffee tray, she saw Colt standing in the main room, and his posture was wrong. Not uncomfortable. Colt was rarely uncomfortable, but contained in the way of a man who has built a careful wall around something and is holding it by discipline rather than ease. The woman sitting across from Margaret was perhaps 35, slim, with dark red hair pinned immaculately and a traveling dress that had not been purchased in Wyoming territory. She had the particular quality of someone who had been considered beautiful for long enough that she had organized her personality around it. She looked at Eliza as Eliza set down the tray. Then she looked at Colt, "So this is the cook," she said. Her voice was not rude exactly. It was precise in the way of a woman who knows how to place words. "This is Eliza Calloway," Margaret said in a tone that was clearly a correction to something in the visiting woman's phrasing. "Eliza, this is Mrs. Catherine Hale. She is passing through on her way to Denver." "Just thought I'd stop," Catherine said, "when I heard Colt was still in the territory." She glanced at him with a smile that contained a history Eliza could not read, but could feel the weight of. "It's been 2 years." "It has," Colt said. His voice was level. Eliza completed pouring the coffee. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the kitchen counter and was completely still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she made the bread, because bread was what she did when her hands needed to be busy, and she made it methodically and without thought, which was the only way she could make it right now. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later. "You heard," Margaret said. "I was in the room," Eliza said. Margaret closed the kitchen door behind her. "Catherine Hale is the widow of a Denver businessman. She and Colt had an understanding 2 years ago, before he came back to the ranch." A pause. "She ended it. She had other considerations. She has since reconsidered." Eliza pressed her thumbs into the dough. "That's his business," she said carefully. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It is." Another pause. "I thought you should know because I prefer for the people on this ranch to have full information." "I appreciate that." "Eliza." She looked up. Margaret's sharp eyes held something that was not pity and was not quite sympathy. It was the look of a woman who has been alive long enough to know what certain expressions mean on certain faces. "He is not in that sitting room because he wants to be," Margaret said. Eliza went back to the bread. "Thank you, Margaret," she said in a tone that closed the subject without slamming it. Margaret left. Eliza made bread. Catherine Hale stayed for dinner. This was Margaret's doing. Margaret had a particular category of hospitality that was indistinguishable from strategy, and her invitation to Catherine to stay for supper had the quality of a woman who wants to observe something. Eliza understood this, but it did not make setting the table for the main house dinner any easier. She served the meal. She was professional and unhurried, and said almost nothing, and showed nothing that she was not willing to show. She had been showing nothing in public for 3 years, and she was not going to lose the skill now. But she watched in the way that people who have learned to be invisible learn to watch. Catherine was charming. That was the accurate word. She had the practiced ease of someone who spent time in rooms that required it, and she brought it to the Whitmore dining table with the casual fluency of a woman who knew its effect. She spoke to Margaret intelligently, to the ranch's business interests, with more knowledge than Eliza had expected, and to Colt, with a warmth that contained something beneath it that Eliza could name, but was not going to name. Colt was polite. He was even measured present, all the things he always was. He answered when spoken to. He did not encourage. He did not perform distance either, which would have told Eliza something different. What he did was look up once when Eliza came to refill the water glasses. Just a look. Brief. No message in it she could be certain of. She filled the glasses and went back to the kitchen. She did not feel what she wanted to feel, which was nothing. She felt instead the very specific anxiety of a woman who has only recently allowed herself to hope something, and is now watching that hope become complicated before it has even been properly examined. This, she thought, is what slow was supposed to prevent. She washed the pots with more force than was technically necessary. It was 8:30 when she heard the kitchen door. She did not turn around immediately. She finished drying the pot in her hands, set it on the shelf, and then turned. Colt was in the doorway. She had not expected him to come tonight, not with Catherine Hale in the main house. "She's gone," he said. "Margaret arranged a room in town." "That was thoughtful of Margaret," Eliza said neutrally. He came in. He did not sit. He stood on his side of the kitchen, and she stood on hers, and the space between them was not large, but it felt like something. "You have questions," he said. "It's not my place to have questions." "Eliza," she looked at him. "What was she to you?" Exactly what Margaret told you, I suspect. He put his hands in his coat pockets, a gesture she had noticed he made when he was choosing words carefully. 2 years ago. 3 months. She was a woman I thought I might build something with. She decided against it. A pause. She was not wrong to. We wanted different things. I wanted to stay in this territory. She wanted someone who would leave it. And now she's reconsidered, Eliza said. She has. Have you? He looked at her steadily. No. She held his gaze. You're certain? I was certain before she arrived, he said. I'm certain now. She's very. Eliza stopped. She was not going to say beautiful. The word was accurate, but it was also the wrong word, the word she was most likely to mean in the specific way that revealed what was underneath it. She is, Colt said, not pretending he didn't know what she'd stopped before. She looked at the kitchen shelf. I told you I needed it to be slow. Yes. I did not mean slow in a way that leaves room for... She stopped again. She was not doing well with sentences tonight. Eliza. His voice was quiet and direct. Look at me. She looked at him. I am not confused about what I want, he said. I have not been confused since the morning I stood in a churchyard and a woman told me she didn't need my pity, and then handed me a shovel, because her hands were bleeding, and she was smart enough to know the difference between pride and judgment. He held her gaze. Catherine Hale has nothing to do with what is happening in this kitchen. She breathed. I'm scared, she said, flat and honest. I want you to know that. I am genuinely frightened, and it is not a small thing, and I don't know what to do with it. I know, he said. I don't know that you do. I'm scared too, he said. She looked at him. Really looked at him, at the careful stillness, and the steady eyes, and the hands in the pockets. Of what? She said. Of being what you need me to be, he said. Of being steady enough. I'm not... He stopped, and the pause had a different quality to it, something she had not heard from him before. I've been alone a long time, Eliza. I know how to run a ranch. I know how to manage men and weather and cattle and 40 kinds of things that go wrong without warning. I do not know if I know how to... He pressed his lips together briefly. Be someone's enough. The kitchen was very quiet. This was the most he had said, the most he had given her, and she could feel the weight of it. You dug a grave in frozen ground for a woman you didn't know, she said slowly, because her hands were bleeding and she needed help. You came back 7 days later because you said you would. You drove 4 hours on account of a 6-line note. She looked at him. You are someone's enough, Colt. You have been demonstrating it for weeks. You just haven't been willing to count it. He was quiet. The quiet was different from his usual quiet. This was not the quiet of a man who has decided what he thinks. This was the quiet of a man receiving something. Slow, he said finally. Slow, she agreed. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the chair. Good night, Eliza. Good night, Colt. He went to the door. He stopped. For what it's worth, he said, not turning around. She never made me want to be better at anything. She just made me want to be somewhere else. He went out. Eliza stood in the kitchen until she heard his footsteps cross the yard toward his house. Then she sat down at the table and pressed both hands flat on the surface and stayed there until she was steady again, which took longer than she would have liked, but less time than she feared. She was not steady for long. The letter arrived the following Monday. It came addressed to Margaret Whitmore, which was how most official correspondence arrived on the ranch, and Margaret brought it to the main house and read it at the breakfast table with a face that gave nothing away, which in itself gave Eliza something, because Margaret's face was a remarkably reliable instrument, and the things it concealed were always the things that mattered. After breakfast, Margaret asked Eliza to come to the sitting room. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and went. Margaret set the letter on the table between them. This is from the county land office, Margaret said. It concerns the piece of land east of the Whitmore boundary, the parcel that includes the water access to the creek. Eliza waited. "There is a claim dispute," Margaret said. "A man named Gerald Voss has filed a competing claim to the parcel. He is a pause that contained something very controlled. He is a man with connections to the territorial governor's office. He has been acquiring land throughout the county for the past 18 months by means that are technically legal and practically dishonest." "What does this have to do with the ranch?" Eliza asked. "Without that water access, this ranch cannot function through a dry summer," Margaret said. "The herd is too large. The creek is the difference between a viable operation and ruin." She picked up the letter. "Voss knows this. That is the point." Eliza sat with this. "Colt knows. Colt has known about Voss for 6 months. He's been managing it quietly." Margaret's expression did something subtle. He did not want to bring it to the household until it became unavoidable. She understood immediately. He had been carrying this. Through all the evenings in her kitchen, through all of it, he had been carrying a threat to the ranch and managing it alone in the way that men like him managed things quietly, without burdening people with what could not yet be fixed. "Where is he?" she said. "He rode to the county seat this morning. He left at 4. 4 in the morning, before she was even awake." She stood up. "What can I do?" Margaret looked at her for a moment with those sharp eyes, and in them was something Eliza had not seen before, not the brisk efficiency, not the strategic warmth, something more direct than either. "Right now," Margaret said, "nothing. The legal matter is in the county seat." A pause. "But when he comes back, he will need someone to tell him that what he is carrying does not have to be carried alone." Eliza stood in the sitting room with her apron still on. "He told me he's afraid of not being someone's enough," she said quietly. "I know," Margaret said. "He has been afraid of that for longer than he would admit. He's been running this ranch alone for 6 years. Yes. And managing this quietly for 6 months. Yes." She looked at the letter on the table. "He is," she said with a certainty she had not known she had until this exact moment. "Enough. He is more than enough. He just doesn't know how to let anyone tell him so." Margaret said nothing, but she folded her hands on the table, and something in her face that had been held in careful reserve for 3 weeks quietly released. Colt came back at nightfall. He came back later than expected, which she knew, because she had been watching the road from the kitchen window since 4 in the afternoon, a fact she was not going to examine too closely. He came through the door of the main house and stopped when he saw her still in the kitchen. The other hands had eaten 2 hours ago. "You waited," he said. "There's food," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She put the plate in front of him and poured coffee, and sat across from him, not to watch him eat, just to be there, which was a different thing. He ate. He did not speak immediately, and she did not push. She had learned the rhythm of his silences enough by now to know this one was not closed. It was open. It was a man sorting through a day that had been heavy. "Voss has a lawyer from Denver," he said finally. "Margaret told me about the claim." He looked up. "I was going to tell you." "I know." She held his gaze. "You were managing it first." Something moved across his face. "I didn't want to bring Colt." She said his name in the way she had heard him say hers, not cutting just clear. "I said I needed it to be slow. I did not say I needed to be kept outside of things." She looked at him steadily. "I'm on this ranch now. Whatever happens to it happens near me. And whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it away from me." He set his fork down. "The claim could take months to resolve," he said. "If Voss has the connections Margaret thinks he has, it could go badly. What do you need?" The question clearly surprised him. She watched him receive it, watched him process a direct question about what he needed, which was apparently not a question he was asked often. "Time," he said, "and a decent lawyer. And—" He stopped. "And—" she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. "This," he said. "Just this. Someone to come home to at the end of a day that was—" He stopped again. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was being honest about something that cost him. I have not had that in a long time. She held his gaze. The kitchen was the only room in the world right now. You have it, she said. She said it quietly and plainly and without decoration, because that was the way he said true things, and she was learning his language. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork and went back to eating, and she sat across from him with her coffee, and neither of them said anything else, and it was the most companionable silence she had sat in for years. Outside, the December wind pushed against the house, and the fire in the kitchen stove burned even, and somewhere in the far corral a horse moved and settled. She thought about Thomas the way she thought about him every evening. Not with the sharp grief of the early days, but with the quieter ache of someone learning to carry an absence the right way. She thought about what he would have made of this kitchen of this man across the table from her, of the fact that his mother was sitting here instead of alone in Caldwell. She thought he would have had an opinion about the horse in the corral. She thought he would have named it something entirely unsuitable and been completely confident about it. She almost said something, almost told Colt. The impulse was there to share Thomas with him in the easy, natural way, the way you share things with someone who has become part of your daily world. She held it for now. But the fact that the impulse existed at all, the fact that she wanted to told her something, whatever this was becoming, it was already more than she had let herself name. And for the first time, that did not frighten her as much as it should have. She sat with that in the warm kitchen and let it be true. The Voss matter did not resolve quietly. Eliza had understood from the beginning that it would not. She had read enough about territorial land disputes in the papers that came through Caldwell to know that a man with connections to the governor's office did not file a claim with the intention of losing it through the normal channels. But she had hoped, in the particular way that people hope when they care about an outcome, that the decent lawyer Colt found in Cheyenne would be sufficient to push back the worst of it. The decent lawyer's name was Arthur Pryor, and he arrived at the Whitmore Ranch the second week of December with a leather case full of documents and an expression that was professionally optimistic and personally worried, a combination Eliza recognized immediately because she had worn it herself during the final months of her marriage. She made coffee. She sat in the kitchen and listened through the door to the voices in the sitting room. Pryor's measured legal cadences, Margaret's precise questions, Colt's even responses, and she did not pretend she wasn't listening because she had told Colt she was not going to stay outside of things, and she intended to keep that. What she heard was this: Voss had filed the claim using a surveying error from 15 years ago. A boundary discrepancy so small it had never mattered until someone decided it should. The discrepancy, if accepted by the land office, would shift the eastern boundary of the Whitmore property enough to place the creek access outside it. Pryor believed the error was correctable. He also believed that correcting it through official channels with Voss's legal team working against them in Denver could take 6 to 8 months. 6 to 8 months through a Wyoming summer without full creek access. She heard Margaret ask the question Eliza was asking in her own head. Can the ranch sustain a full summer on reduced water? A pause. If the herd is reduced by a third, Colt said, and if the summer isn't as dry as the last two. Another pause. We're not reducing the herd, Margaret said. Margaret, we are not reducing the herd, she repeated in the tone that ended discussions. Eliza took the coffee tray in. 3 faces turned toward her. She set the cups down, distributed them without comment, and turned to go back to the kitchen. Stay, Margaret said. She turned around. Eliza has been on this ranch for 3 weeks, Margaret said to Pryor in the tone of a woman establishing a fact. She has a clear head and she does not panic. I'd like her to hear this. Pryor looked at Eliza, the way men in his profession looked at women in kitchens, not unkindly, just with the particular blindness of someone who has filed things in categories. Colt was looking at her differently. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, which was directly and without the blindness. Sit down, Eliza, he said. She sat. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Pryor laid out 3 possible approaches. Margaret asked questions that revealed she understood territorial law better than Pryor had anticipated. Colt said less than either of them, but what he said was precise. And Eliza watched Pryor adjust his assessment of the situation, with every statement Colt made recalibrating the way smart men do when they realize the person across from them is smarter than they prepared for. Eliza said nothing for the first 90 minutes. Then Pryor said in the middle of explaining the third approach, "The challenge is that Voss's surveyor submitted the boundary claim with a supporting affidavit from 2 witnesses in town. Caldwell witnesses." She looked up. "Which witnesses?" Pryor checked his papers. "A Franklin Mears and a Dr. Emmett Page." The room was quiet for 2 seconds. Eliza felt something move through her that was cold and very clear. Franklin Mears, who had called things out at the churchyard. Dr. Emmett Page, who had not come on the night Thomas died. She looked at Colt. His expression had not changed, but his eyes had. Something had sharpened in them, and she knew he had made the same connection she had. "Those men," she said carefully, "are not reliable witnesses to anything regarding this property. Neither of them has been to the eastern boundary. Mears runs a dry goods operation. Page is a physician whose practice is in town." She kept her voice even. "If their affidavit is based on personal observation of the boundary, it cannot be accurate." Pryor looked at her. "That's a reasonable challenge," he said slowly. "If we can demonstrate they have no direct knowledge of the disputed boundary." "They don't," Eliza said. "I know both men. I lived in Caldwell for 3 years. Neither of them has any business at the eastern edge of this property." She paused. "What I don't know is what Voss offered them to sign." Pryor sat back. He looked at Colt. He looked at Margaret. Then he looked at Eliza with the recalibrated expression. "That," he said, "is a very useful piece of information." Margaret's eyes met Eliza's across the table. Neither woman said anything. But something had shifted, and they both knew it. "Dad." After Pryor left with enough new material to return to Cheyenne and begin dismantling the affidavit, Margaret went to the kitchen. She stood in the doorway and watched Eliza wash the coffee cups. "How did you know?" Margaret asked. "About Mears and Page." Eliza set a cup on the shelf. "Because I know what kind of men they are. Small men with large opinions about things outside their experience. A man like Voss would have found them easy." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Colt was right about you." Eliza glanced at her. "What did he say?" "Many things," Margaret said. "Over a period of several weeks and in contexts he thought were private." The almost amusement was back in her expression. "I run this ranch, Eliza. Very little happens here that I'm not aware of." She went back to the cups. "He said you were the most honest person he'd met in the territory," Margaret continued. "He said that the second or third time he came back from Caldwell. He also said—" She paused. "He said that being around you made him feel like someone he'd been trying to be for a long time and hadn't quite managed." Eliza stood with both hands around a coffee cup and did not move. "He didn't tell me that," she said quietly. "No," Margaret agreed. "He's better at knowing what he feels than at saying it, which is the particular affliction of men who are very competent at everything else." She pushed off the doorframe. "I thought you should know." She left. Eliza stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she put the cup on the shelf with great care and went back to work, because work was what she had, and she was not going to stand in someone's kitchen having feelings about a man who had not said the thing directly, regardless of what he had said to Margaret. But the thing lived in her now. She could not unknow it. The week between Christmas and New Year was the hardest stretch. Not because of Voss. Pryor had sent word from Cheyenne that the affidavit challenge was moving forward, and that Mears and Page had been significantly less cooperative when faced with specific questions about their knowledge of a boundary they had never seen. The legal front was holding. What made that week hard was something smaller and more personal. Christmas at the Whitmore Ranch was a practical affair. Margaret organized it efficiently. There were extra rations for the men, and Eliza cooked for 12 hours straight and produced a meal that even Hatch called, with the maximum available sincerity, real fine. It was busy and warm and full of the specific happiness of people who have worked hard and are eating well. And in the middle of it, between the second and third wave of dinner service, Eliza went to the back door for cold air, and the cold hit her, and Thomas hit her simultaneously with a force she had not anticipated. Christmas. He would have been 2 years and 7 months. He would have been entirely confident about what presents he deserved, and entirely wrong about most of them. She pressed her hand to the doorframe and breathed. She did not hear Colt come up behind her. She only knew he was there when he said quietly, "Eliza." She did not turn around. "Give me a moment." He gave her the moment. He stood behind her, not touching, not crowding, just present the way he was always present. Solid and there. "Thomas," she said when she had the voice for it. "I know," he said. "He would have been—" She stopped. He had opinions about everything. He would have had opinions about this ranch, about the horses. She pressed her lips together. He would have named all the horses inappropriate things and been completely certain they were good names. Behind her, Colt made the sound that was almost a laugh. The genuine one, short and quiet. "Sounds like he was something," he said. "He was everything," she said. Then carefully, "He still is. That doesn't—" She turned. Colt was right there, closer than she'd realized. "That doesn't go away. I need you to know that. Whatever I become going forward, he is still there. He doesn't get smaller to make room for anything else." Colt looked at her. "I wouldn't ask him to," he said. She held his gaze. "You say that now. I'll say it in 5 years," he said. "Because I mean it now, and what I mean doesn't change based on the calendar." He held her gaze. "I want to know about him. All of it. The horse names, and the song corrections, and whatever else. I want to know everything about who he was." A pause. "If you'll let me." She felt something give way in her chest, not break, give way, like a gate opening, She looked at him in the cold doorway on Christmas evening and thought about what it cost him to say that a man who measured his words so carefully that each one he offered was real. "General," she said. He looked at her. "Beg your pardon?" "The dog he was going to get," she said. "The one he'd never met but was already planning. He was going to name it General." She watched his face. He was 2 years old, and he had already named a dog he didn't have yet. Colt's expression did something she had not quite seen before. It was quiet, and it was warm, and it was the face of a man receiving something he had not known he needed. "General's a good name for a dog," he said. "It's a terrible name for a dog," she said. He was completely confident about it. Colt looked at her for a long moment. "Eliza," he said, and then he stopped, and the stop had weight in it, and she braced herself because she could tell from the quality of the pause that what came next was one of the things he had been carrying. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I need you to let me say it without stopping me, because if you stop me, I'll lose the exact right words, and they'll come out wrong, and I can't afford them to come out wrong." She looked at him. "All right." He held her gaze. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while. I don't know the exact day it happened, which is unusual for me, because I'm a man who tracks things. But somewhere between the churchyard and this kitchen, it became the realest thing in my life, and I have been moving slowly, because you asked me to, and because you were right to ask, and I will continue to move slowly for as long as you need. But I needed you to know what direction I'm moving." The cold air moved between them. "Colt." "You said you'd let me finish," he said. She pressed her lips together. "I know what you carry," he said. "I know about James Calloway and what it cost you to trust someone who didn't stay. I know about Thomas, and I know that love doesn't get replaced, it gets added to, and I am not asking you to make room where there isn't any. I'm asking you to let me stand in whatever room you have." He stopped. "That's all." That's what I wanted to say." She stood in the cold doorway. She had prepared, over the past 3 weeks, a number of reasonable responses to the possibility of this conversation. She had thought about what she would say, and how she would say it, and what cautions she would voice, and what conditions she would name. Every one of them was completely inadequate now. "I'm frightened," she said. "I know." "I'm not saying no," she said. He was very still. "I'm saying," she took a breath, "I'm saying that I believe you, and I believe what you've shown me, which is worth more than what you've said. And I am—" She stopped, made herself say the true thing. "I feel the same way. I have felt it for longer than I've been willing to admit, and that has terrified me, and I don't have a guarantee that the terror goes away, but I—" She looked at him directly. "I choose this, whatever this is. I choose it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he raised his hand and touched her face, just the edge of his thumb against her cheek, the smallest possible gesture, the kind that takes more courage than large ones. She did not move away. "Slow," he said. "Slow," she agreed. He lowered his hand. They stood in the cold doorway together for another moment, close enough that the distance between them had finally become something honest instead of cautious. Then she said, "The bread's going to burn." He stepped back. "We can't have that." She went back inside. He followed. And it was the most ordinary thing that had ever happened, and also the most significant, and neither of them remarked on the combination, because some things are too real for commentary. The second week of January brought two things simultaneously, and they arrived within 48 hours of each other, which was the kind of timing that made Eliza believe the world had a specific and inconvenient sense of drama. The first thing was a letter from Pryor in Cheyenne, with news that was good and complicated in equal measure. The affidavit from Mears and Page had been successfully challenged. Both men had, under direct questioning, admitted that their knowledge of the boundary was secondhand, provided to them by Voss's representative, which was sufficient to have the affidavit struck. This was the good part. The complicated part was that Voss, rather than withdrawing, had escalated. He had brought in a second lawyer and filed an amended claim with new supporting documents, and the amended claim was stronger than the first. Pryor's estimate of resolution had extended to 12 months. 12 months. Margaret read the letter at the breakfast table and said nothing for a full minute, which was the closest Eliza had seen her to something other than composure. Then she folded the letter, set it beside her plate, and said, "All right, what do we do next?" Not a question. A starting point. Colt looked at Eliza across the table. She said, "I have an idea, but you're not going to like the first part of it." The idea required going back to Caldwell. Not permanently. One day, 2 at most. Eliza needed to talk to 2 people, Pete Driscoll, who had been in Caldwell for 30 years and had a long memory for property lines and survey disputes and the kind of informal knowledge that never made it into official documents, and the land office clerk, a young man named Henry Oakes, who had worked there for 5 years and who Eliza happened to know had a particular weakness for her apple pie. She presented this to Colt and Margaret over coffee after breakfast. Margaret said, "When can you go?" Colt said, "I'm coming with you." Eliza looked at him. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm coming." She considered arguing. She did not argue, not because she didn't have the capacity for it, but because she had looked at his face and seen that this was not negotiable in the way that things were, sometimes not negotiable, and she had learned enough about him by now to know which hills he was going to die on. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. Riding back into Caldwell on a Thursday morning in January was a specific experience. She had not been back since the day she left 6 weeks ago, and 6 weeks was enough time for a small town to have built several new stories about her departure and what it meant. She could feel the stories in the air the moment the wagon turned onto the main street, the glances from the general store porch, the particular stillness of people who have been caught mid-sentence. She kept her eyes forward. Beside her, Colt drove without comment. Franklin Mears came out of his dry goods store when they were passing and stopped dead on the sidewalk, and his expression went through 3 clear stages in approximately 2 seconds. Recognition guilt and the aggressive reconstruction of his face into something that looked like it had never contained guilt at all. Colt looked at him once. Mears went back inside. "That felt satisfying," Eliza said at a volume appropriate for private conversation. "I didn't say anything," Colt said. "I know. That's the satisfying part." She saw briefly the full version of the almost smile. Pete Driscoll was at the livery, which was where Pete Driscoll always was, and he received Eliza with the manner of a man who had decided somewhere in the last 6 weeks that he owed her something. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "good to see you looking well." "Mr. Driscoll," she said, "I need to ask you something." "I figured," he said. He looked at Colt. "Whitmore Ranch." "Yes, sir," Colt said. Pete nodded slowly. "The Voss business." "You know about it," Eliza said. "There ain't much that happens in this county I don't hear about eventually." He leaned against the livery door. "What do you need?" "The eastern boundary," Eliza said. "The original survey. You were here when the Whitmore property was first established." 1867, Pete said immediately. "I was 22. I helped drive the stakes for the original survey." Colt went very still beside her. "You were there," Eliza said carefully. "I was there." Pete's eyes were steady. "And I can tell you exactly where that eastern boundary was placed because I drove the stake myself, and I have a good memory. And I can tell you that wherever Voss's surveyor says it is, it ain't that." The livery was very quiet. "Would you be willing to say that?" Colt said to a lawyer in Cheyenne. Pete looked at him. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the ground for a moment, and she could see him calculating something, the cost of a thing against the need for it, the specific arithmetic of a man who had stayed quiet once, when staying quiet was wrong, and was being asked now to correct it. "I'll say it to whoever needs to hear it," Pete said. "I'm 71 years old and I drove that stake myself, and I ain't going to let some Denver man tell me I'm wrong about it." Eliza looked at him. "Thank you, Pete," she said. He waved it off. "Should have said something a long time ago," he said, "about more than one thing." He looked at her directly for the first time since the conversation began. "I'm sorry about your boy, Mrs. Calloway. He deserved better, and so did you." She held herself very steady. "Thank you," she said again. It was not the same thank you. He heard the difference. She could tell by the way he nodded. Henry Oakes at the land office ate 2 pieces of apple pie and produced from a filing cabinet that had apparently not been properly catalogued in several years the original survey documents from 1867, including a surveyor's field note that matched Pete Driscoll's recollection of the stake location, with enough specificity to make Eliza's hands shake when she read it. She did not let them shake visibly. She copied the relevant section by hand, word for word, with the methodical care of a woman who had taught herself whatever she needed to know when no one else was available to teach her, and she folded the copy into her coat pocket. "Henry," she said, "I need you to hold these originals for Pryor's review. Can you do that?" "Henry." Oakes looked at her, and then at Colt, and then at his pie. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Don't let anyone else access them before Pryor sends someone for them." He nodded in the manner of a young man who has just understood that the piece of pie he accepted was actually a commission. "Yes, ma'am." She shook his hand. She walked out of the land office with Colt beside her and the original survey copy in her pocket, and Pete Driscoll's word to a lawyer in Cheyenne, and the pieces of Gerald Voss's amended claim beginning to come apart. Outside on the Caldwell Street, she stopped. She turned the copy of the survey over in her hands. "This is enough," she said. Not a question. With Pete's testimony, Colt said, "Yes, it's enough to put the boundary back where it belongs." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression that she had enough experience with now to read the complete direct attention, the thing that was not pity and not charity, and was just him looking at her and seeing her. "You did that," he said. "Pete did the work in 1867, she said. "You knew to ask him," Colt said. "You knew who to go to and what to ask for and how to get it." He held her gaze. "That's not nothing, Eliza." She looked at the paper in her hands. She thought about the version of herself 6 weeks ago standing in a churchyard in frozen ground with bleeding hands, believing that the town of Caldwell was the perimeter of her world and that the perimeter was unrelentingly unkind. She thought about what it had taken to get from there to here. "No," she said quietly. "It's not nothing." He held out his hand. She looked at it. She had taken his hand once before in the wagon leaving Caldwell and let go immediately because she had promised slow, and slow mattered. She took it now and did not let go. They stood on Caldwell's main street with the winter sun on them, and anyone watching from the general store or the dry goods or the saloon could see exactly what they were seeing, and she did not care. And that was the most significant thing of all. Not the legal victory in her pocket. Not the stake Pete Driscoll had driven in 1867, not even the man whose hand she was holding. The most significant thing was that she did not care. She had stopped performing self-sufficiency for an audience that had never deserved the performance. She had simply become someone who was walking down a street holding the hand of a man she loved in the town that had once been the whole of her world and was now just a place she was passing through. The world had gotten larger. She had let it. That was the thing nobody warned you about when you finally stopped carrying everything alone. Not that the load got lighter, though it did, but that the world expanded to fill the space where the weight had been, and it turned out to be considerably larger and more generous than the version you'd been surviving in. She held his hand. She walked. Behind her, Caldwell did what Caldwell did. Watched. Talked. Formed opinions. She kept walking. She did not look back once. Pryor's letter arrived on a Friday morning in late February, and Eliza knew before she opened it, not because she was prescient, because she had learned over the course of 3 months on the Whitmore Ranch to read the weight of things before they were named. The letter was thin. A thin letter from a lawyer meant either very bad news delivered briefly or very good news that did not require elaboration. She stood at the kitchen counter with it in her hand and made herself finish pouring the coffee before she opened it, because she had learned that making herself finish small tasks before opening large ones was the only way she had ever managed uncertainty. She set the pot down. She opened the letter. The land office had ruled in favor of the Whitmore Ranch. The original 1867 survey, corroborated by Peter Driscoll's sworn testimony and supported by the field notes Eliza had found in Henry Oakes's filing cabinet, had been accepted as definitive. Gerald Voss's amended claim was rejected. The eastern boundary stood where Pete Driscoll had driven the stake 56 years ago, which meant the creek access was Whitmore land, and had always been Whitmore land, and would continue to be Whitmore land for as long as anyone on the ranch could fight for it. Pryor's final line said, "The affidavit witnesses Mears and Page have been referred to the county attorney for review of their original submission. I expect nothing significant will come of it, but they will have been uncomfortable for several weeks, which is probably sufficient." Eliza read that last sentence twice. She put the letter down on the counter. She stood very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then she went to the back door and opened it and called across the yard to the barn, where she could hear Colt talking to Hatch about something involving the east fence line, which had been a recurring subject since December. "Colt." His voice stopped. A pause. Then footsteps. He appeared around the corner of the barn with his hat pushed back and his coat open despite the cold, because he always ran warm, a detail she had catalogued without meaning to over the past 3 months. "Kitchen," she said. Something in her face told him something, because he crossed the yard at a pace that was faster than his usual unhurried stride. She handed him the letter when he came in. He read it. She watched his face. He was not a man who showed things easily, she knew that by now. Better than almost anything else she knew about him, but something moved in his expression as he read something that started controlled and did not stay that way. He set the letter down. He looked at her. "Pete's testimony," he said. "Pete drove the stake." "You knew to ask him." "You said that in Caldwell," she said. I heard you the first time." He looked at her for another moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he put both arms around her and held her, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him, the warmth and the canvas coat and the heartbeat, and she let herself be held, which was something she had not allowed herself in longer than she could accurately measure. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She pulled back after a moment. She was not crying. She had considered the possibility and decided against it, at least for now, at least until she had told Margaret. "Go get Margaret," she said. "She's in the sitting room." "Then stop taking up my kitchen and go get her." He almost smiled. He went. 2. Margaret read the letter with her hands flat on the sitting room table and her face doing nothing whatsoever for 30 seconds. Then she looked up at Eliza, who had brought the coffee because bringing the coffee was what she did, and she said, "Well." "Well," Eliza agreed. Margaret picked up the letter again. Read Pryor's last line. Set it down. "Mears and Page," she said in the tone of a woman completing a thought she had begun several months ago. "Uncomfortable for several weeks. Pryor seems to feel it's proportionate. Pryor is a generous man." Margaret's expression contained something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in its vicinity. She looked at Eliza over the coffee cup. "This ranch would have been in serious difficulty without what you found in that land office." "Henry Oakes found it," Eliza said. "He just needed a reason to look." "You gave him the reason." Eliza sat with that. "I grew up being told I wasn't useful," she said. Not bitterly, just plainly the way she said most true things. Not in those exact words, but in every practical way that amounted to the same thing. She picked up her cup. "I find I am still surprised sometimes when the useful thing turns out to be something I did." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "That stops," she said. "In time." Eliza looked at her. "The surprise," Margaret clarified. "Eventually you simply expect to be capable because you have enough evidence." A pause. "It takes longer than it should, but it stops." She said it with the authority of someone reporting from the other side of a distance, and Eliza filed it away the way she filed things that mattered completely, and for keeps. March came in like a reckoning. The winter broke with the speed that Wyoming sometimes managed 1 week frozen the next week mud, the week after that green, as if the land was impatient with itself. The ranch shifted into the particular controlled urgency of spring, which Eliza had not seen before and which was something to behold. 23 men who had spent the winter in relative containment became 23 men with 100 things to do simultaneously, and the kitchen scaled accordingly. She was up at 4, some days at 3:30. She did not complain about this because there was no one to complain to at 3:30 in the morning, and also because she found genuinely that she did not mind it the way she had expected to mind it. The kitchen was hers in the early morning hours, in a way it was not at any other time, and she had learned to value the specific quality of her own company that those hours allowed. Colt found her at 4:15 one Tuesday morning, which was early even by his standards. She heard the door and did not look up from the dough. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," he said. He sounded different, not troubled exactly, but carrying something the way he sometimes carried things at the start of a day before he organized them into their proper weight. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's almost ready." He sat. She heard the chair shift under him. She worked the dough. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it." A pause. Not the comfortable kind. She looked up. He had his hands on the table, not clasped, just flat, the way she put her hands when she was being honest about something that cost her. He was looking at the middle of the table. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said. "For the ranch. For—" He stopped. "For us. Whatever us is." She waited. "I'm not a man who does things without intention," he said. "You know that about me by now." "I do," she said. "I have intentions," he said. I want to be clear about that. I have very specific intentions, and they have been specific for a while, and I have been—" He stopped again. "I have been moving slowly, as requested." "As agreed," she corrected gently. "As agreed." He accepted. He looked up at her. "I'd like to move less slowly now, if you're—" He pressed his mouth together briefly. "I am asking you something, and I am doing it poorly." She set the dough aside. She wiped her hands on her apron. She came to the table and sat across from him. Not because she needed to sit, but because this was clearly a conversation that required them to be level with each other. "Say the thing directly," she said. "You're better at direct than you think you are." He looked at her. "Marry me," he said. Just that. No preamble, no construction, just the words. The kitchen was absolutely still. She looked at him. She looked at the hands flat on the table, and the gray-green eyes, and the face she had learned over 3 months in the particular way you learn things you intend to keep. And she thought about a churchyard in frozen ground, and a man who took a shovel from bleeding hands without making a performance of it. And she thought about coffee made in her kitchen on a bad day, and 7 days that were exactly 7 days, and not 8. And she thought about Thomas, who would have had an opinion about this, and would have been completely wrong about the specifics and entirely right about the heart of it. She thought he said it directly. I told him he was better at it than he thought, and he believed me, and he said it directly. She thought I have been waiting without knowing. I was waiting for someone to say an uncomplicated thing and mean every syllable. "Yes," she said. He was very still. "Yes," she said again, steadier. "That's my answer. Yes." He let out a breath that told her he had been holding it, which she would think about later and find enormously dear. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. "The bread's going to need another 10 minutes, she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not stopping the bread." "I wouldn't ask you to." They sat at the kitchen table at 4:15 in the morning, holding hands while the bread waited, and it was the most significant decision either of them had made in years, made in the most ordinary possible way, and neither of them thought that was a flaw in it. It was, in fact, exactly right. So, the twist when it came arrived on a Wednesday in April, and it came from the last direction she had expected. James Calloway walked into the Whitmore ranch, not into the house, into the yard. She saw him from the kitchen window, recognized him immediately, despite 3 years, and the particular way time changes the face of a man who has not been living well. He was thinner. He was standing at the yard gate with his hat in his hand, and the stance of someone who has rehearsed what he is about to do and is less certain of it in practice than he was in preparation. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at him for a full 30 seconds. Then she dried her hands and went outside. She stopped 5 feet from the gate. She did not open it. "James," she said. "Eliza." His voice had changed too, less assured. You look well." "I am well," she said. He looked at the ranch behind her. He looked at her face. He was calculating something she could see it, trying to assess what he was dealing with, which was a version of her that was considerably different from the version he had left. "I heard you'd moved out here," he said, "from Caldwell. Word travels. I heard—" He stopped. He turned his hat in his hands. "I heard about Thomas." She held herself very still. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it's not—" He stopped again. He was not. She registered a man who had gotten better at saying true things in 3 years. "He was my son, too." "He was," she said. "He was your son who you left when he was 4 months old." The words were flat, not cruel, just accurate. James looked at the ground. "I know," he said. "What are you here for, James?" He looked up. I don't know what I thought. I heard you were here, and He took a breath. "I'm not in a good place, Eliza. Things have not gone well. I thought maybe—" "No," she said. He blinked. "I haven't." "I know what you're going to ask," she said. "And the answer is no." She looked at him steadily. You left Thomas and me in Caldwell with 14 months of marriage behind us and a house that needed repairs and a winter coming. You did not send money. You did not send word. You sent nothing." She kept her voice level. "Thomas learned to walk without you. He learned to talk. He named things with complete confidence, and was usually wrong, and I loved him more every single day, and he died without ever knowing his father's face." She paused. "I have no anger left for you, James. I spent it. What I have now is a life I built while you were gone, and you have no part of it." He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, and the face of a man receiving something he deserved, and had not until this moment been willing to stand still for. "Eliza, I'm going to ask you to go," she said. "Not because I hate you. Because you have nothing to offer me, and I have nothing to give you, and we are both better served by being honest about that." She heard boots behind her. She did not need to look to know. Colt came to stand beside her, not in front of her, not between her and the gate. Beside her. Exactly beside her, close enough that she could feel the solid reality of him at her shoulder. James looked at him, looked at Eliza, looked at the way they were standing. Understanding moved across his face. Not pleasant understanding. The kind that shows a man a thing he could have had and chose to leave. "Is that—" James started. "Yes," Eliza said simply. A silence. "He's a lucky man," James said, and to his credit, he said it without the kind of edge that would have made it a lesser thing. "I know it," Colt said, quiet and certain. James put his hat on. He looked at Eliza one more time, and she let him look because she was not afraid of being seen by him anymore. She had been afraid of a great many things for a great many years, and James Calloway's opinion was not on the list. "Goodbye, James," she said. He tipped his hat. He turned and walked back down the road. She watched him go. Beside her, Colt said nothing. He waited until the figure was small in the distance. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and she wanted it said, "I'm better than all right." She turned and looked at him. "I have been better than all right for some time now. I'm still getting used to it." He looked at her with that complete, steady attention. "Get used to it faster," he said. She looked at him. "I'm working on it," she said. They married in June, not in Caldwell, not in a church that would have required Reverend Hale's participation, which neither of them was inclined to request. They married at the Whitmore Ranch on a Saturday morning with the whole of the ranch present, and Margaret Whitmore standing up with Eliza, and Hatch standing up with Colt, which was a development that surprised Eliza considerably, until she thought about it, and then found she was not surprised at all. The circuit preacher who married them was a spare kind man named Thomas, and when he introduced himself, Eliza felt the name land in her chest, in the particular way it landed now, which was not grief exactly, but the specific weight of love that does not have anywhere to go anymore except inward. She told Colt his name that evening. He was quiet for a moment. "Good name," he said. "The best name," she said. She wore a cream-colored dress that she had made herself over the course of March and April, in the early morning hours before the kitchen work began. Not because she didn't have other options, but because making it herself meant it was entirely hers, made by her hands fitted to her body the way she actually was, rather than the way she was supposed to be. It was good cotton, well cut, with small buttons up the front, that she had found in a general store in Cheyenne when Colt took her there in April, for reasons that she had understood and not commented on. It fit her perfectly. She was a full, solid woman, and the dress was made for exactly that, and she wore it the way she wore herself, without apology, without amendment, without any interest whatsoever in making herself smaller. Nora Jenks cried because Nora Jenks had ridden out from Caldwell specifically to witness it and had been prepared to cry since approximately February. Pete Driscoll stood at the back and nodded once when the preacher finished the nod of a man checking something off a list he'd been keeping. Margaret Whitmore did not cry. She stood straight and still, and watched with an expression that was composed and satisfied and contained at its very furthest edge something that might have been joy if you knew where to look for it. Eliza knew where to look. Afterward, when the food was eaten and the ranch hands had offered congratulations in the various ways that men offer congratulations, some eloquent most, not hatches consisting entirely of a handshake that lasted 4 seconds and a single word, "Good," which Eliza took as the highest possible praise from the source. She found herself standing alone for a moment at the east edge of the yard. The creek was visible from here, just barely the line of cottonwoods that marked its bank the specific green of spring water in a dry country. She thought about Gerald Voss, who had tried to take it. She thought about a filing cabinet in Caldwell and a field note from 1867 and a 71-year-old man who drove a stake into the ground and remembered exactly where. She thought about how things hold. She thought about Thomas. She always thought about Thomas. But it was a different kind of thinking now, more like conversation, more like the thing she had felt the first time she told Colt about him, and the telling made him larger rather than smaller. Grief, she had learned, did not have to be a diminishing. It could be a carrying. You could carry someone with you into the life that came after them, and they did not make the life heavier. They made it more real. "Hey," Colt said behind her. She did not startle. She had stopped startling at his footsteps weeks ago. "Hey," she said. He came to stand beside her the same way he always stood beside, not in front of, not behind. Level. "What are you looking at?" he said. "The creek," she said. "Good creek." "Very good creek." She paused. "Worth fighting for." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, which was still new enough to be remarkable, and which she suspected might remain remarkable for a considerable time. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "The east pasture," she said. "The flat section near the cottonwoods. The soil is good there. I've been watching it." She paused. "I'd like to plant something." He looked at her. "What kind of something?" "A garden," she said. "A real one. Vegetables, obviously, but also—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "There's a variety of blue columbine that grows wild out here. I've seen it on the ridge. I'd like to grow some in the garden." She kept her eyes on the creek. Thomas loved blue. Everything blue. He'd point at the sky and say, "Blue Mama," like he'd personally invented it. She stopped. "I'd like to have something blue growing here. Something that comes back every year." Colt was quiet beside her. She waited for the quiet to tell her what kind it was. "We'll build the beds this week," he said. She looked up at him. "I'll get the lumber from Cheyenne," he said. "Hatch can help with the framing. You'll need good depth for columbine, they root deep." He met her eyes. "We'll build it right." She held his gaze. "You looked that up," she said. "Last week," he said. "When you mentioned wanting a garden." She stared at him. "I mentioned it once. In passing." "I know. You went and found out how to grow columbine." "I had some time in the evenings." She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 3 years in Caldwell, believing that the version of love available to her was the diminished kind, the kind you settled for the kind that left the kind that watched from across the street. She had spent 3 years managing alone and calling it enough and being wrong about it being enough in the specific way that people are wrong about things they cannot afford to be right about. She had not expected this. Not a man who drove stakes and built beds and looked up columbine root depth in the evenings because she had mentioned wanting a garden once in passing. Not this. "Colt," she said. "Yeah. I love you." She had said it before twice, both times at night, both times quietly, but she said it now in the open air of their own yard on their wedding day, in a voice that was not quiet at all, and it felt like something she had been building toward for a long time finally reaching its right height. He looked at her. "I know," he said, and then because he was who he was, "I love you too, more than I've got good words for." She leaned back against him and looked at the creek. "We'll need to decide about the house," she said. He looked down at her. What about it? My room off the kitchen, she said. It was appropriate when I was the cook. You're still the cook. I'm the cook who is also your wife, she said. Those are related positions but not identical. The sleeping arrangements should probably reflect the distinction. She felt him laugh. Actually laugh, the full version she had only heard a handful of times, quiet and genuine and entirely real. I'll talk to Margaret, he said. She already knows, Eliza said. She probably arranged it before we married. He considered this. You're probably right. I'm almost always right. You're learning that. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, brief and matter-of-fact, the kind of gesture that was not performed for anyone, and did not need to be. She closed her eyes for a moment. She felt the sun. She felt the spring air coming off the creek. She felt the solid reality of him beside her, and the life that had arranged itself around her in the months since a frozen churchyard, and she held it all without trying to verify whether it was real, because she had learned that the need to verify was what you did before you trusted yourself, and she trusted herself now. She opened her eyes. The garden, she said. I want a bench in it. All right, a good one, something permanent. Permanent, he agreed. So that someone can sit in it, she said, years from now, and see the blue. He understood. She knew he understood by the quality of the quiet that followed. We'll build it right, he said again. They stood together at the east edge of the Whitmore Ranch, with the creek running where it had always run, and the columbines not yet planted, and the bench not yet built, and the years not yet lived. And between them was the kind of certainty that does not shout because it does not need to. The kind that has been tested by frozen ground and legal claims and dead of winter grief, and come out the other side, not unscathed, but intact. Not unscathed. Intact. There is a difference, and Eliza Mae Calloway Bridger had learned it the hard way in the specific school that only life in full can run, and she carried the lesson the way she carried everything now, not as a burden, but as a thing that was hers. Her losses were hers. Her love was hers. Her garden would be hers. Her life built from the wreckage of the one she had not chosen into the shape of the one she had was entirely, completely, irrevocably hers. And in the middle of it stood a man who had looked up columbine root depth in the evenings, just in case she needed to know. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Years later, travelers passing through the valley sometimes stopped at the Whitmore Ranch. Bridger Ranch. People had started calling it a name that had come into use without ceremony, the way true names do. They stopped for water or directions, or sometimes just to rest, and they were always fed because the woman who ran the kitchen had never learned how not to feed people who were tired. Sometimes they asked about the garden on the east side of the property, the large one with the raised beds and the bench set into the center of it, and the blue flowers that came back every spring without anyone doing anything particular to encourage them. They were told it belonged to the woman of the house, that she had planted it years ago, that it came back every year because that was what columbines did. They rooted deep, and they came back. The travelers looked at the bench and the blue flowers, and they nodded and moved on, and they carried the image of it down whatever road they were on, and some of them thought about it later on, harder days without knowing why. A garden that comes back, blue every spring, rooted deep. That was the whole of it. That was enough.